Pozdrav, dragi narode, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu Slobodni. Današnja tema je woke. Neki bi rekli woke ideologija. Neki od vas su čuli za to, ali vjerujem veliki dio vas i ne zna točno o čemu se radi. Zato sam istražio upravo u kolijevci nastanka toga, Sjedinjenim državama, i upravo sam imao priliku i danas vam predstavljam nekoga koji je to duboko istražio, koji piše knjige o tome, koji sudjeluje u panelima i kojem uistinu danas može objasniti o čemu se radi. Tako da kad sretnete, odmah prepoznate. Stoga mi je velika čast danas predstaviti gospodina Jamesa Lindsayeja. Hello, Mr. James. Welcome to our show in Croatia.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you say a few words about your background?
Yeah, sure. So originally I have a degree in physics, and then I went on to study mathematics, and I have a PhD in mathematics. So I was a mathematician. I began studying philosophy of science in the 2010s, independently, ended up discovering woke because basically feminists were taking over everything that was interesting in society at the time. And so in 2017 and 18, my friend Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose and I did something called the Grievance Studies Affair, where we submitted 20 false hoax articles to academic journals in gender studies and sexuality studies and race studies and so on. All these woke studies to show that they're captured by an ideological fashion. And this began my professional study of woke, which I've been doing ever since professionally full time. So in 2020, we wrote a book, Helen Pluckrose and I, who did the project with me together. We wrote a book called Cynical Theories. That's in 30 languages now and is sold all over the world. And then I've gone on to identify the Marxist elements, the communist elements that underlie woke theory ever since. And I haven't stopped. I run a company called New Discourses to explain this as fast as I can learn it.
Can you tell us, simply as possible, what is definition of woke and when the root is coming from?
The simplest thing to say is that another term I use for woke is 21st century communism. It's Marxism reinvented through identity politics. It obviously means that you woke up to something. That's why it's called woke. But what you woke up to is that the old class conflict that communism talked about, the bourgeoisie and the worker, is actually playing out in many dimensions in society. It's male versus female. It's straight versus gay. It's black versus white, or it's citizen versus immigrant. So it's playing out in every dimension of society through identity all at the same time. So it's the same Marxist alienation, the same Marxist envy, the same Marxist attack and attempt to seize the means of production of society, but now through culture rather through economics.
And where this root is coming from which movement?
It comes from a movement called critical theory, primarily, but it has elements of postmodern theory, as it's called also. But these are ultimately derivative theories in the school called Western Marxism. So as you would understand, obviously, better than I can over there in Croatia, there was Eastern Marxism, which you were subjected to brutally until the 1990s, which was developed in the Soviet Union. But the rest of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, did not go for Marxism. It didn't take off in our countries. And so what developed over the 20th century was a school of thought that looks at the culture of capitalism rather than the economic system, and tries to overthrow it from within rather than by an external revolution. And so it's ultimately communism retooled to get inside the culture and erupt from the inside rather than take over from the outside.
And how they operate? What is this new moralism and what is epistemic?
Yeah, so the primary way that they operate is by convincing people that they have some kind of either a sense of guilt for being privileged in society based on being, whether they're male or whether they're a citizen or whether they're white or whatever identity category matters most in your population because it varies from one country to the next based on where the agitation will work. But they convince some people that they're privileged and other people that they're being cheated, that they're oppressed by a system of power like systemic racism, or that the citizenship rules are unfair and exclude, the immigrant from full participation in society. And so the idea is that they create a moral rule set or moral paradigm where there's still the oppressor versus oppressed, exactly like on page 1 of the Communist Manifesto. It's just that the classes that are in conflict are different. And so the way that they organize the world is that if you are inside the privileged world, the privileged side of things, your morals are self-serving, your knowledge is self-serving. It's all designed to keep people like you in power, even if you don't know it. So maybe you're a useful idiot for the ruling class, but if you're in the oppressed group, then you have other knowledge and other morals that are actually more important because they're outside of the system. They challenge the corrupt system. And so there's a preference, as it's called, for subjugated knowledge, indigenous knowledge, racial knowledge, sexual knowledge, standpoint knowledge, they call it. And so there's a preference for that which is outside of and critical of the existing system in woke.
And there is a few theories that we have to go through because they are explaining lots of this, what you are talking right now. There is a post-colonial theory. What is this?
Yeah, post-colonial theory is the main way that it works in the story of immigration. The idea is that the Western European powers went and colonized the world, whether it's Africa, whether it's South Asia, whatever it happens to be, India, Cambodia was French, I think. They went and colonized these different parts of the world. And so now colonization is an imposition of illegitimate power. It is the attempt to force one cultural view on other parts of the world in the name of civilizing them. And that now has to be rejected. So the post-colonial theory comes from a very violent thinker by the name of Frantz Fanon originally. He was an Algerian psychoanalyst, and he wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth, where he explains that the colonized person, the colonized native, regains his personhood through violence against his colonizer, literally by murdering the person who stole his native identity from him. And so you have now a Marxist theory of colonization and of reclaiming one's identity, of awakening to who you really are. And this has spread across all of the kind of countries that were very prominent in the colonial enterprise. Like I said, France, Spain, Germany, to a degree, Britain, and all of the British Commonwealth have all taken this up. But it's an attempt to use this idea of colonial status as a justification, say, to justify bringing lots of immigrants in very practical terms. The argument would be that these European powers stole from Africa, so now Africa has a right to go take over their countries and get their wealth back and get their status back. And it's an entire Marxist theory of why we should be able to shift power from these Western northern countries to what they call the global South and the global East, to reverse that power dynamic.
And that means that this generation, ourselves, we should feel guilty because somebody before us colonized some of these countries.
That's right. So that's the mechanisms are two. One is guilt for the people who are allegedly complicit in the crimes like colonization. And then there is the feeling of alienation for the people who are allegedly victims of that. And so you want to get as many people in both the oppressor class to feel guilty as you can, so they'll sell out their own society to assuage their guilt. And you want as many of the people in the so-called oppressed class to feel like they've been cheated so that they'll want a revolution and to steal power.
Is this the reason why you can see now so many immigration, but people are mostly passive? They don't see anything wrong with this.
Yeah, actually it is. If you read this book that I mentioned, The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, it was actually a Frenchman that wrote the foreword to this book. He's very famous as Jean-Paul Sartre wrote the foreword to this book, and he explains, look, the people that you colonized deserve the world, and they're going to come and get it. So you have two choices. You can either give it to them and maybe they won't kill you, or you can let them kill you and take it. And so the mentality of a lot of the elites across Europe for a generation now has been, well, we better, try to make amends. We better try to, make up for those crimes and that pain and any theft that they believe has happened. So what you see is that they are giving away their societies in order to try to allegedly make up for the crimes of the past as they see it.
And we see this in the United States until Trump came, and now he's stopping this illegal immigration, they call it. But now we are feeling this in Europe because we have policy of immigration.
Yeah, I think it's much worse in Europe by far, even before we had President Trump stop things. But President Trump has said no more. It's actually been an inspiration to other parts of the world. But as you can see, with the story unfolding in Minnesota right now, for example, it's also a source of great conflict. So this is where I draw your attention back to that woke at its roots is Marxism. It's the same communist agitation, the same putting the target in a bad position to where he loses no matter what he does. If you don't enforce immigration law, then you get overrun. But if you do enforce immigration law, then you're a tyrant who's keeping people out, and people need to mobilize against your police, who get framed out like they're Gestapo or Nazis or whatever else that they're saying. So this is classic Marxist agitation. This is all built off of the same tricks that Lenin and Stalin ran in Soviet Union, whether it was with Ukraine, whether it was with Georgia, Lithuania, Caucasus, Tartars. They ran this playbook in the 1920s. They brought it to Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and you know the history very well. But it's the same playbook, and people think, no, it's about caring about people that have been hurt in the past, about racism, and so it's not. It's the same playbook as communism.
Yeah, we are feeling sometimes that we need to have more empathy for them because they are poor. But you're saying that this is the plan.
Yeah, I mean, they say you need to have more empathy for them, but that's not what they actually want. What they want is you to give away resources to them and give away power to them. The Russians, the Soviets, called this korenizatsiya. They had a name for this program. It ran through the 1920s. It's the same story that they would say, look at the peasants. They don't have any land. They don't have any bread. They don't have any grain. They don't have any money. And why? Well, it's because of these wealthy kulaks who are keeping them out of being able to have a farm that they can run. And so what did they do? They crushed the kulaks. They said that the kulaks were stealing from the poor peasants, and they promised the peasants that they would have land and bread and peace in return for helping them crush the farmers that were actually producing food. And so it's the same thing, that they don't want you to be empathetic. They want you to give away your society, and they want you to give away your power to people who are going to concentrate it for themselves. It is a scam meant to concentrate wealth and power in very few hands that are working according to communist theory and communist practice.
It looks to me that they are also fighting against capitalism, not only against some colonialism.
Yes, absolutely. And anywhere you look, whether it's in that post-colonial literature or whether it's in the street out today, they say that the purpose is that capitalism has to be smashed. Capitalism is the problem. And the actions that they take are consistent with undermining a system, a wealthy free market system. Like if you look at New York City, they flood in all these immigrants and it gets very expensive, and housing gets very expensive. So the government says now we have to have government controlled housing, government controlled rent. This is a communist playbook, right? And so the goal, though, is that it's what happened when we had all the inflation, for example, which of course was caused by some other things. What happened? Well, they said it was the grocery stores and the shopkeepers who were greedy. And so we're going to introduce price controls, and we're going to have state-run grocery stores. We're going to have city-owned stores. Their answer was actually to take power and to control it through the state. And they tried to overwhelm the system and make it too expensive for the system to run to justify being able to do that. And then they blamed it on the shop owners, the billionaires in California that are being run out with their wealth tax. They're blaming it on those people being greedy. The landlords are being greedy. The grocery owners are being greedy. But this is just I mean, this is a Communist Playbook 101. This is as plain as possible. So the word in the literature that they use for this is co-constituted. They say that, and that's a fancy word, but what it means is if there's colonialism, capitalism is the cause. And if there's capitalism, it will do colonialism. So they work together. If there's sexism, it's to benefit the capitalist system, and the capitalist system uses sexism to benefit itself. So they work together. Same with racism, same with all these things. And so it's just a way to take, again, the old Marxist theory and repackage it in a way that Europe and America and Canada and these Western nations will accept, because they won't accept economic communism outright. It has to be mixed with something where there's the guilt and the empathy for identity categories.
But United States is built upon immigrants. And I don't understand how it's possible that in the United States this is coming, this post-colonialism, because colonist countries are mostly coming from Europe. And before United States were colonial countries from side of Great Britain and France. And now this root of this movement.
Well, America is the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world, and therefore it's the biggest target in the world. It didn't matter which communist state, whether it's Soviet Union, whether it's the People's Republic of China, whether it's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It doesn't matter. The United States is the big target, and so communists, both outside and especially communists inside the United States, have understood that undermining the United States by any means necessary is actually necessary to advance the plan. Khrushchev, when he was still alive in Soviet Union, said, of course, that he was going to, it would be the case that they would take the America without firing a single shot. He bragged about that. And how would you do that? Well, you subvert its culture. You flood it with illegal immigrants. Well, how do you justify flooding it? Well, there's your post-colonial theory. So you get these academics, and then the academics get the policymakers to believe this stuff. Then you get a big, body of the population to say that that's what they want and to vote for those politicians. And then you open the borders and just let the problems start to pile up. And of course, the solutions you're going to propose to those problems are going to be, more state control, taking away from the producers, taking away from the capitalists. And so it's a long-running plan, but because the United States is so wealthy and powerful, and because it is kind of, in a sense, the inheritor of the entire Western civilization tradition, it's the primary target. And so it doesn't matter that it doesn't matter if the theory makes sense. They still apply it because it works.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned they are trying to do this through education. And let's go directly in this Marxification of education, because you also wrote a book about this. Can you explain us how they took over? We call it this march through institutions. How they took over institutions, exactly education.
So just historically speaking, they attempted to take over the culture kind of directly through riots and so on in the 1960s, 68, 69. The city of Detroit, as people probably all around the world know, still has not recovered. It went from one of the best cities in America to very poor and dangerous now. It hollowed out the city. So these riots failed. America did not accept this kind of neo-Marxist communist revolution in the direct form. And so you have the kind of architects of this, people like Herbert Marcuse, who was a critical theorist in the Frankfurt School, the school of Marxism for the West, critical theory. And he comes out and says, we're going to do the long march through the institutions in his book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, that he wrote in 1972. And he says, in particular, we're going to go into education at all levels, because what he understood was everybody in the entire professional class in an advanced economy went to college. Every single one of them, almost to a man. You have people who, whether they're lawyers, whether they're journalists, whether they're in media, they went to communication school. Even if they are a pastor in a church, they probably went to a seminary. So they are all educated people. Educated people are in every professional class. And that's how society is actually controlled. So he says, we're going to go in. We're not going to yell outside in the street anymore. We're going to go into the professions, and we're going to change them from within. That's called the long march through the institutions. It took them through the entire 1970s into the early 1980s to start making any real headway. But it started actually with people during the end of the Vietnam War era staying into college longer so they could get advanced degrees instead of going to fight in the war. So they were able to protest the war and get an advanced degree. You get this huge number of PhDs coming out of the early 1970s as a result. Almost all of them go off to become college professors somewhere and start to populate the colleges. They're all leftists. They're all this new left thinking. They're going into education at all levels. In the 80s, they started to take over the schools of education to complete this program. A guy named Henry Giroux is his name, went around in the early 1980s and intentionally got 100 radicals. He brags about it. He got 100 radicals tenured in colleges of education all over North America, but especially in the United States. And the goal was so that they could bring in this new radical education system that he believed in, that came from a Brazilian Marxist named Paulo Freire. And this is what the book, The Marxification of Education, is about. Because Paulo Freire created a new model. He was one of these post-colonial guys in Brazil, and he said that it was capitalism and colonialism that kept the peasant poor. And he came up with this new idea that education should be the way that you convince people of the Marxist interpretation of their circumstances. So you're poor, why? Well, let's learn to read, but while we learn to read, let's learn to read the social situation. Let's learn to read the politics. He played this kind of language trick. And he said that political literacy is actually more important than actually being able to read as literacy. So his expression, to use the technical phrase, is that the academic material will become a mediator to political knowledge. What that means for the everyday person is, whether it's math, whether it's reading, whether it's science, whatever, the lesson in the school becomes an excuse to talk about politics. So you bring up the math question and you use the math question as an excuse to talk about a political issue. You say, maybe, in this subtraction problem, we're talking about how far somebody's going to drive. Well, is it really good to drive that far? Let's talk about environmental issues. And so then you talk about the political issue instead. Or you talk about a family and you say, well, there's a mom and a dad and this and that and this. And then you say, does every family have a mom and a dad, or can some families be two moms or whatever? And you can talk about feminism or the sexuality stuff in place of the academic lesson. And this was what he called education for liberation. And this got retooled into something called critical pedagogy as it came to the United States. And then critical pedagogy became called culturally relevant education. These are all, buzzwords, but these are the names that you can track how this got installed in the U.S. education system. And of course, the U.S. education system then spread it to the world. But what developed in Brazil under this Paulo Freire is what he created is a Marxist theory of knowing, of knowledge. So some people have declared themselves to be knowers and other people are ignorant. And it's not that they really know more, it's that they've decided what counts as knowing. So they're like a bourgeoisie of knowledge. And they keep everybody else ignorant and impoverished so that they can't get the good job, so they can't control society. And so you see that they are able to therefore control everything through who's allowed to be considered knowledgeable. And so his goal is to then say, you know what? No, your knowledge of your own circumstances is real knowledge. Your personal lived experience is real knowledge. It counts just as much as the scientist, as the accountant, as the politician, as the professional. It's knowledge too. They don't want you to know that, but it is. And let me tell you what it really means. And then they give them a Marxist interpretation of the experience that they have to go out and agitate with. And this was his program.
That means they indoctrinate all the students. And finally, if you come with your degree, with your diploma, and then you know better than others, and then they're using this knowledge, as you said, to preserve you that they are right.
Yes, and to put specifically to favor hiring Marxist radicals as professionals. So, this is what the kind of DEI, or the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion program was all about, is it's about setting up a stage where somebody who understands the Marxist perspective on their identity is more correct and more valid and more moral and more righteous than somebody who doesn't. So you preferentially hire radical activists to bring them into every single institution, education, media, law, medicine. And then this is where we are now. All of our institutions, our medical societies, our law societies, our media, obviously, a lot of our politicians all get captured by this because there's a preferential hiring program that gets introduced alongside. And that's what we call DEI. And again, I stress that's what the Soviets called korenizatsiya. It's as a well-known playbook for bringing the outsider in. And then if anybody criticizes them, it's some kind of chauvinism. In Russia, it was the great Russian chauvinism. How dare you criticize a Ukrainian comrade? It's great Russian chauvinism. And now it's how dare you criticize this, black woman? That's sexism and racism. It's the same exact playbook.
Yes. Can you explain just a few words what is this diversity, equity, and inclusivity? And please explain this part, because they're using this for everything. Meritocracy is not any more important. It's important, this DA.
Okay, so I'll try to make this not complicated, but diversity means diverse to the accepted system you already have. Okay, so it means outside of the accepted system. The fancy word for that is counter-hegemonic. That's the Antonio Gramsci communist word for it. So the goal is to bring in radical activists. They're diverse. This comes back to Lenin's definition of diversity, which he used in Soviet Union, raznoobrazia. My Russian is not good, so deal with the bad pronunciation, but raznoobrazia, which Lenin said means diversity in form with unity in content. The way that Stalin translated that was national in form, but socialist in content. So you have different nationalities, different identity groups, but so they're diverse, but in fact, they all think the same because they're all socialists, or they're all critical theorists, or they're all communists, depending on the context. So diversity means bringing in radicals who believe in the critical theories of identity under the guise of hiring people with different identities. You have a black person that you hire, for instance, or an immigrant, but you only hire the ones who are radicals, who believe in their identity theory in a radical communist way. This is the diversity. Inclusion works the same way. It is you include that which is counter-hegemonic and exclude that which is hegemonic. So you include the diversity according to what I just explained, but you exclude people from the majority culture. You exclude people who are, native citizens or who are in the so-called dominant groups. You exclude the rich people. You exclude the white people. You exclude the men, and you, in the name of including other people. So it's a discrimination program organized in order to bring those people in and bring the radicals in and protect them. And equity is a very tricky concept. But because it sounds like it means equality, but it's the actual piece of the puzzle that's most important. This is what the Soviets called actual equality, and my Russian's too bad to attempt that one. Fakticheskoye равенство or something like this. Actual equality. And so the program is actually, the equity means having your fair share of what you've invested. If you purchase a house and you've paid off half of your mortgage, your equity is it's how much you've paid in plus the appreciation of your house. You don't have the other half yet, but that's your equity. That's the part you own. If you buy stocks, your equity is the share, the amount that you earned by having those stocks. So it's your fair share. Well, the communist theory is that everybody is supposed to be equal. So everybody's supposed to have a fair share that's equal. And so when there's inequality based on group identity, there must be some system of power keeping you out of equality. So now we're going to adjust the shares to make people equal. So it's a very tricky way to justify forced redistribution of wealth, of power, of resources, of opportunity, particularly opportunity and employment, in the name of equaling out what they say are inequities, where, say, white people earn on average more than black people, or men earn on average more than women. They say, well, that's obviously an inequality. It's obviously unfair. And so in the name of equalizing that, we're going to give, black people or women advantages, affirmative action, preferential hiring, extra scholarships. or, a faster path to career advancement and promotion. And that's the program that we call DEI. But again, this is a Soviet Union program of equalization across all aspects of life: economic, professional, cultural, social. It's called actual equality in the Soviet Union. I don't know what else to tell you. It's communism.
Yeah. Well, we have to go through all other theories because you already mentioned some elements, but let's explain. What is critical race theory?
Critical race theory, I wrote a book about this too, and the title tells you what it is. It is race Marxism. So that's the title of the book, Race Marxism. It is the exact idea that you can read in the first paragraph of the Communist Manifesto, where he says, all through history is the conflict of contending classes. And he says, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed. Well, instead of creators or bourgeoisie versus proletariat, it's owners versus workers. Now it's white versus people of color. And he says that this fight is constitutive of history. It's what makes history move. It's the essential piece. And what happens is that eventually it becomes a conscious fight, and the oppressed group rises up and fights back, led by its vanguard, which is located in the Communist Party for the communists, and it's in the critical race theorists for critical race theory. And they're going to, he says, openly have the fight so that you either have the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or the common ruin of the contending classes. Then he ends the Communist Manifesto, of course, with workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, or however, the workers of the world unite, the working men of the world unite. And now it's minority races of the world unite. It's the same idea, the exact same program. So it is, instead of the bourgeoisie, it's white people. Instead of the proletariat, it's people of color, and especially blacks. And instead of the ideology of capitalism, it's the ideology of white supremacy. Instead of private property, it's the cultural property of whiteness. And it's exactly the same program. Instead of a dictatorship of the proletariat, there's going to be some board of the anti-racists, or this Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, very famous person in critical race theory, actually argued that you end inequality by creating an all-pervasive government agency that can override the entire society and judge every action, public or private, every law, every policy according to whether or not it produces racism or anti-racism. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat redone in racism. And so it's just Marxism reconstituted around race, where the line in society is black versus white, and it's white supremacy instead of capitalism, and it's whiteness instead of private property. But if you understand communism, just make it about color and you have the same program.
If I look in Europe now, I more see that white race is in danger from this, for others who are immigrants here. Is this danger for the future, that white race will be really the one who will be attacked?
It is for the time being. The future is hard to tell because this doesn't work. It didn't work in Soviet Union. It didn't work when Mao Zedong brought it into China and ran it in the People's Republic under the doctrine of defeat Han chauvinism, is what he called it. He ran it with the Han race versus the 55 minority races of China. It doesn't work. It works for about 10 years to break up a society, redistribute resources, advance a lot of radical agendas, and then it starts to fall apart. So what Soviet Union did next was Stalin in the early 1930s did what he called Russification. So he made the Soviet Union Russian again. And his doctrine was that Russians would be first among equals, whatever that means. That's one of these communist lies by language, right? How can you be first among equals? There's no first when there's equals, right? So it's a communist dialectical baloney term, but this is a possible future. I don't know if it is the future. But right now, the white race, the male sex and the native citizen are under attack from these different intersectional outsider groups: the racial minority, woman, and the immigrant. And the white people in Europe, by the demographic history of these countries, are particularly at the kind of apex of this attack. And so it may be the case that they are continued to be put into danger and pushed on. And it may be the case that the governments suddenly switch at some point to a doctrine of first among equals and try to turn things around once they think there's enough socialism extracted. It's unclear. But the answer in the short term is yes, they're in danger. The same way that Marxists put the wealthy in danger.
What is feminist theory?
Same thing with, there were lots of feminist theories, and
please go through and explain us these feminist theories, because this is very interesting.
Yeah, feminist theory is the most complicated, and it's, there are jokes to be made about angering a bunch of women, some of whom get very upset when you don't do this right. But the dictionary definition of feminism is advocacy for the equal political, social, and cultural standing of women to men, which most people in the developed world largely agree with. We think that women should be able to have mortgages and, participate in civic life and get jobs if they want them without facing, policies to just say no women allowed. Okay, that's one thing. But then there's also a Marxist feminism. There's a Marxist theory where you now have a system of power called patriarchy, where the men, even though they don't know it, are conspiring to keep women out of all of political power. And so you have male versus female as oppressor versus oppressed, and you have the exact same Marxist concepts. It's enforced by the hatred of women called misogyny, and its ideology is, like I said, patriarchy and male supremacy. And so there's an entire theory where it's basically that is separate from just talking about political, social, and economic equality for people to be free, whether male or female, to live their lives as they wish. There's a separate theory that basically all the men are conspiring as a class against all the women as a class, and they're going to be intrinsically in class conflict. That is, I think, not only very destructive on its own, because it's still a Marxist theory of identity that still tears apart I think the most important bond in any society, obviously, is the male to female bond, because that's how you build families. That's how you build the next generation. It's how you raise children. That dynamic, to be colorful, literally moves the world. That's the romance of the whole world, is male and female for us. And so to make that antagonistic is very dark and very poisonous and very dangerous. And this, more radical feminism does that. And it's not healthy. It's not good for the society. But what is more important to the conversation we're having about woke is that all of these theories, whether it's the critical race theory, whether it's the post-colonial theory, whether it's the gender theory and the queer theory and the transgender issue, have all passed through the lens of feminism in order to be palatable to the Western audience, especially the American audience and the British audience. So feminists took up the race issue because they got accused of being too white. And then the race people took up the feminist issue by saying that the racial liberation programs were too patriarchal and too masculine and sexist. And all of it fused under a program that a lot of people say, they point out that woke is very feminine in its character and that it seems to disturb women more than men. But that's because it all got colored and it all got designed to enter society through feminist issues and through feminist tools that were designed to target women, young, vulnerable women in particular, more than anybody else. And so feminism became kind of the melting pot for all of these woke theories that made them different in some sense than the original communism that you'd see in Soviet Union or China.
Is this attack on family? Because we mentioned this in this documentary. You were guest there, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and they are attacking. Beside, they need to attack family. They need to attack church, a religion, education. Is this attack on the family?
Yes, absolutely. And it has to be. And this isn't just because Karl Marx wrote about how the family is a bourgeois institution that maintains capitalism, although it's the same logic. It's because the family is the primary unit of society. It's the first model of governance that most people understand. But more than that, what the Western Marxists were interested in is how does culture propagate itself from one generation to the next. So maybe our culture in 2025 is very capitalist, but by 2035 or 2040, there's a new generation and maybe they'll be socialist. How do you make that change? And so the answer is that you go into the culture producing institutions, the media, the education, and the law, and so on. But the most important ones are the family and the church, because that's where people get their values. That's where their foundation is. And so there has to be an attack on the family, because otherwise the family will raise children well. And what raising children well means is raising them to be good members of the society they live in. Productive, successful, valuable contributors. Well, if you are a valuable contributor who's productive and successful in your society, that means you're maintaining your society. But the communists do not want you to maintain your society. They want a revolution. They want socialism. They want a different society. So they have to disrupt that transmission of values from parents to child, from teacher to student. And so from pastor or priest to person in the pews at church, to churchgoer. They have to disrupt those transmissions of values. And the way that you do that is to get inside those institutions. It's very hard to get inside the family. It's much easier to tear the family apart. So you have a deliberate attack on the family so that the family cannot raise children, and instead they get raised in other social institutions, like by the state or in a state-run school, or something like that. So the goal is to tear apart the family, because the family is the only institution you cannot actually infiltrate. You can infiltrate a church and run a fake message. You can infiltrate the media and run propaganda. You can infiltrate education and indoctrinate. You can't do that with the family, so you have to destroy the family.
And also one of attacks on family is also queer theory. Can you explain us this?
Queer theory is the most important, I think, attack on the family that we face. And it's this idea that, again, just like all these other theories, some people declared themselves better than others. There's an oppressor versus oppressed. Like with Paulo Freire and education, he said, some people said the knowledge they have is real knowledge and everybody else is ignorant because they don't have that knowledge. Well, the queer theorists believe that it comes from a branch of radical feminism and sexual theory that broke off in the 80s. But the idea is that some people declared themselves as normal and everybody else is a weirdo. And these weirdos, whether they're strange or whether they're perverts or whether they're, deviants or whatever word you want to use, gathered together under the banner of the word queer and called themselves by that word that's generally been considered impolite and a slur for a long time. So they called themselves queer as opposed to normal. So certain people declared themselves normal. They get full participation in society. Everybody else is queer and they don't get full participation in society. And that's a imbalance in power. That's a conflict of power, oppressor versus oppressed, same idea. But the idea now is to make everything abnormal at once. But the attack on the family is the most powerful because it targets vulnerable children. And when you're a child, you can believe fantastic things. A lot of children, I want to think of something that doesn't ruin Christmas for anyone. So a lot of children believe, if you tell a child, you could grow up and be a dinosaur one day, maybe they would believe that because they're a kid. Well, anyway, if you tell them, if you don't feel comfortable in your body as a little girl, maybe it's because you're actually a little boy inside and you don't know that. And they see the other little boys and maybe they like to play sports and they like to be with the boys more than they like to be with the girls. And it resonates. The idea is to get them thinking about their identity, whether that's their so-called gender identity, whether that's their sexuality, who they think is prettier, boys or girls, who they're attracted to, in a way that is different than their parents, that's outside normal. So that when the attack on the family is when they come and they tell their parents, oh, I think I feel this way. I think I'm really a boy, even though I'm a girl. That their parents will be shocked and upset and say, no, you're not. And now you have a fight because they can make it very important to the child to believe this. This is who they are. And they feel like they've really been led to understand themselves in a way that makes them feel better about something they were anxious about or uncomfortable with. And so now their parent is in conflict with them, and then the state that has been teaching them in this is on their side. So you end up separating the child, at least emotionally, and maybe even eventually physically, with some of these laws they've passed in the United States, from their parents, and you can tear the family apart. But the mechanism is to say, normal doesn't really exist. That's a system of power. It's an ideology. It's not real. You can be whoever you are. Here's a bunch of options that are outside of the normal. And when they find ones that people feel good with, then the idea is to create the conflict mostly inside the family, but inside of society as well. To say that the goal you can imagine is to have the child come home from school and say, "Mom, I'm trans," and then mom to be angry and say, "No, you're not," and then for them to fight, and then to say, "Well, that's very dangerous, so the state can step in and now take your child away and educate them in what they say is a safe space, but is actually not safe at all. It's a very dangerous space." But this is the goal, is to create that conflict, to break that bond between parent and child, between mother and son, father and daughter, on purpose, by making the child believe something that's dangerous and bad for them, so that when the parent tries to correct them, it's a fight.
Can you explain what means that gender is performance? That means there is no any more sex. It's not connected. Gender is something different from the sex. And what this mean as a performance?
Yeah, this is the idea. This comes from a queer theorist who's most prominent in the 1990s. She's still alive. Her name is Judith Butler. And this idea that she had was, like, imagine, like, you're a judge or you're a policeman, right? And so, you live your everyday life. You go to, the restaurant, you go to church, you live your life. But then when you say you're a judge and you go sit at the bench and you put the robes on and you have the gavel in your hands, now you speak a certain way and you present yourself a certain way, and you're very formal and you're very, important, and you act like a judge. That idea was called performativity by a guy named J.L. Austin. And Judith Butler said, that's how we live all of our life all the time. So if we're male and we do male things, we're performing male in the same way that a judge performs being a judge, or a police officer, gets tough the second he puts his uniform on and he has this professional demeanor. So we're performing maleness or we're performing femaleness. So if a man is effeminate, he can be male and performing female. And if a woman is very effeminate, she's a female who's performing a female role. And that these roles are, most men act manly and most women act womanly. And this brainwashes all of society, or socializes all of society, that men are supposed to act one way and women are supposed to act another way, which doesn't admit for people who don't feel that way. So, Judith Butler herself is a bit of a butch lesbian. So she doesn't fit neatly. She doesn't feel like a feminine woman. So where does she go? And she says, well, society makes me feel like I have to be a woman in a certain way. And she decides everybody's just performing their gender, like a drag queen. A drag queen is a very exaggerated version of this performance that's being done consciously and on purpose to exaggerate certain characteristics to make critical points. It's a form of social critique as an art form, if we'll call it an art form. Well, her point, and she actually says this, is that life and drag are the same thing. Drag is life. Life is drag. You're always doing drag. So you as a man, looking like a man, dressing like a man, wearing a suit, are performing male drag. And I'm performing male drag, and a woman is performing female drag. Everybody's doing drag all the time. And we can break free of that. That's the idea. So you can step out of the performance and you don't have to do it. So what she comes up with is this idea of messing with the stability of male and female stereotypes by, on purpose, accepting the performance of the opposite sex. Performing, if you're a female, performing as a male, or performing as a female deliberately in the wrong way to confuse things. And this is a deliberate tactic of queer theory, based on the theory that being male doesn't have anything actually to it. So sex doesn't matter. Being female doesn't have anything actually to it. There's nothing to being a woman. There's nothing to being a man. It's just that we're all people and we're all performing roles, and sometimes they line up with who we are and sometimes they don't.
We need to pass just one more important thing. What is intersectionality?
So intersectionality is how you put all these ideas together. You have the sexism, the post-colonial stuff about immigration and colonialism. You have the race. You have the class. The elements of capitalism versus the oppressed, the bourgeois, proletariat. You have all these different theories of oppression, all these different lines that divide society: sex, sexuality, gender, race, and so on, and immigration status. You have to somehow make one cohesive theory out of that, and intersectionality is the tool that does that. Intersectionality says that all of those forms of oppression, whether it's class or race or sex or whatever, are actually all the same thing, that there's a whole system designed to hold all kinds of different people down. And what it actually is, in communist language, is it's a way to build a united front out of a bunch of different identity groups who feel like they're analyzing their circumstances in a Marxist way. So it's a tool for building a united front across different identity groups who are feeling oppressor versus oppressed Marxist analysis for themselves. That's what intersectionality is. It's the united front logic in order to get all of the different identity Marxist groups operating together.
And they want to implement new morality. They call it social justice.
Yeah, social justice is this idea that groups have rights and groups can have privileges, and that everything has to be made equal across those. I mean, ultimately, this term, the actual words social justice, literally come from a Jesuit theory, a Catholic theory of how to be fair to the poor and how to help widows and orphans and things like this to try to help the needy. But it got co-opted. And what I said earlier still holds true. This is the doctrine of actual equality that the Soviet Union put forth, the Fakticheskoye равенство. I can't say Russian words, I apologize. So this actual equality program, the idea was that it's not just economic equality. That's the first level of equality that you have to achieve. You also have to have cultural equality, social equality, equality of opportunity in all professions and all roles in society. You have to have equality in every single domain. And so social justice is this idea, like, look, if you look at the group of, say, immigrants, or you look at the group of Black people, or you look at women, they are not coming out equally. They don't have equitable outcomes in society. Therefore, we have to use our power to readjust the system so that they come out equally. And so it's the program of redistributing shares in order to make groups equal. They wrote explicitly about this. They say that where Western free countries are concerned with individual rights, social justice is concerned with something they call group rights. So it's all about redistributing to the group based on averages about the group, and therefore not to individuals. It's incredibly unfair to individuals because individuals are just thought of as members of the groups.
And for the end, can you explain to our audience how they can recognize when they see something what is woke, and which question they should ask to be sure that is woke?
I mean, you guys in Croatia, I think, would be better than any of us in America because a lot of you experienced communism. If it feels communist, it's probably communist. So I'll say that first. But the fact is, if it's, you can tell if it's woke, if it's based in this idea of oppressor versus oppressed with systemic power. If you start to see people split the society into the oppressor versus the oppressed, and those oppressors and oppressed are rooted in identity groups, and that the solution to that is to redistribute opportunity and access and power and resources, then you're dealing with woke. It doesn't matter which identity. It doesn't matter who's doing it. If the goal is that some identity groups are oppressing other identity groups, so we have to have a redistribution, then you're dealing with woke.
Thank you, James. Thank you for your work. I highly recommend your books. They can find on Amazon, each one of these. And I think we'll be in touch because this is something that was very actual in Croatia.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope all the best for Croatia. It's, I hear, a very beautiful country.
Yes, for sure, we are. Thank you. Evo, dragi narode, nadam se da ćete danas uspjeti, iako nam je bilo kratko vremena da sve objasnimo. Uistinu ima tu jako puno i toplo preporučam knjige da pročitate, jer tu je objašnjenje. Naime, s tim se susrećemo svaki dan, iako ne prepoznajemo. Naime, imali smo i dokumentarac u koji sam predstavio sa gospođom Judy Bidding, koja je objašnjava u stvari da je to, kako se kaže, ispod janjiće kože. Dakle, sa vanjske strane je janje, ali ispod kože se krije vuk. A vuk se zove neokomunizam ili neomarksizam, kako god. I on je implementiran u sve dijelove našeg društva. Malo obratite pozornost. Kada vidite ove nove ideje da se što više treba uključiti u društvo u odgoj naše djece. Ili kada kažu vam da se na izborima treba učlaniti što više žena zato što treba biti jednaki broj muškaraca i žena. A mislili smo do sada da u stvari se na izborima biraju oni koji nas najbolje predstavljaju bez obzira kojeg su spola. Ili kad primjećujete baš u hrvatsku specifičnost da kod nas imaju određeni saborski zastupnici upravo povlašteni status ili pripadaju nekoj naciji, možda je čak i to dio ove ideologije, jer naime, ako smo svi jednaki, a jesmo svi jednaki, onda smo jednaci bez obzira na našu naciju. Međutim, u stvarnosti tako nije. Dakle, svakodnevno se susrećemo sa tim. Evo, primjer je najnovije upravo ideja da se u zdravstveni odgoj uvedu određeni elementi koji u stvarnosti pripadaju odgoju kod kuće. Dakle, roditelji su zaduženi da usade određene vrijednosti svoje djeci, da ih nauče nekim stvarima, međutim, čini se da je ovog trenutka ideja da što više društvo utječe na odgoj djece, što bi ovdje moglo jasno pokazati iz ovih objašnjenja kako indoktriniraju iduće generacije. Dakle, svakodnevno se možemo susreći sa primjerima koji pokazuju ovo i bez ikakvih sumnji dolazi ideologija iz istih izvora. Naime, samo provjerite ljude koji to promoviraju, otkud dobivaju sredstva za svoj rad, gdje su se educirali, gdje su im dali ove diplome u kojima oni nam objašnjavaju kako oni znaju nešto o tome, a mi eto ne znamo kako se rade djeca, ne znamo kako se odgajaju, jer tko zna kako smo mi odrasli postali ozbiljni ljudi. Dakle, htio sam danas ovom emisijom sa stručnom osobom koja se time bavi objasniti kako se mi sa ovim susrećemo, iako to ne prepoznajemo. Iako je ovako kao što kaže gospodin Lindsay, a ja vidim na sličan način, onda se mi susrećemo sa novim komunizmom, a svi vrlo dobro znamo kako je taj komunizam u prošlosti prošao. I ima ozbiljnih razloga zašto se iza tog sustava našlo stotine miliona mrtvih. Jer naime, ako vi na silu pokušavate nametnuti nešto što nije prirodno, naravno da ćete naletiti na otpor, a nakon otpora dolazi sukob, a u sukobu ima uvijek i stradalih. Stoga još jedanput ponavljam, pročitajte knjige da bi razumjeli stvar kako bi mogli prepoznati i nakon toga odlučiti da li ste vi uistinu za to da naše društvo u budućnosti izgleda tako ili već sada, ili ipak možda imate neka druga ili stara, kako bi rekli, moralna stajališta koji su vam dovoljan put ili pokazatelj kamo trebamo ići. Nadam se da ste bili zadovoljni sa današnjim gostom i temom. Hvala vam lijepo na pažnji i uskoro se vidimo u sljedećoj epizodi Slobodni.